My name is Sarah Carr-Locke, and I am a Ph.D. candidate at Simon Fraser University in the Archaeology Department. George Nicholas, the IPinCH project director, is my supervisor. My Ph.D. research is looking at collaborative methods in museums, so I'm really concerned with looking at how Indigenous people and museums work together to represent Indigenous heritage. So what I was looking for are the different ways, as I was saying, the different methods and ways of working together. So really what I found so far, being about 3/4 of the way through my fieldwork, is that there's a real diversity. And that's, I don't know that that was a surprise, but that's been one of my big findings, is there's no kind of one standard way to collaborate. There are a standard set of community-based methodologies that we talk about, and I think a lot of people talk about in projects like IPinCH, but these aren't used universally in museums as ways to collaborate. Some of them have advisory boards or members, Indigenous community members whose role it is to represent the community. Some of them have other ways of working. Sometimes it's just for an exhibit, sometimes it's through the use of memoranda of understanding. So there's a real diversity in the method. So that's what I found. A lot of people have talked about Indigenous ways of working with museums. There's especially with the development of the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian, there's been a lot of increasing conversation about what are some different ways of doing museology, caring for collections, and working with Aboriginal people. There's been a lot of work also in New Zealand and of course in Canada as well. So my contribution is to kind of step back and say, okay, there's a lot of conversations about what ethical practices are, but I would like to look at how they're working in practice, so I hope to add to the conversation that way. I'm also kind of looking at institutions that haven't been studied quite as much. There's some that get a lot of attention, and for example, going up to Yellowknife, to the Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Centre, there's not a lot that's been written about what they're doing up there, and even Bishop Museum in Hawaii that I visited, they're doing some really amazing things, but because of being sort of off mainland US, there's not as much attention, and they don't have the chance to participate in conferences and stuff at the same level. So hopefully I can bring some of their perspectives into dialogue with others. Well, something I've been thinking about recently is, what I'm concerned with and interested in is representations that are created through museum exhibits. So, we think about the academy a lot and academics a lot. We talk about archaeology and anthropology both in IPinCH or in my classes and otherwise at SFU. But I think one of the parts that's missing for me is that we don't pay enough attention to how that information is translated to the public. So I see museums as a really interesting example of, IPinCH talks about the rights of Indigenous people to benefit from the products of research, but then also how does that research get translated and presented to the public. So I see that as one of my foci there, is to look at that presentation of the research, and also I think that those representations in museums through exhibits are the intellectual property of Indigenous people. When you tell a story about someone and you create an image of someone, that can be seen as part of their intellectual property, so that they really have the right to participate in manufacturing and creating those exhibits and stories about themselves. I do believe that representations created in museums, for a lot of people, that is that's their interaction with Native people and Native culture, is in a place like a museum or an art gallery. They aren't, like a lot of the people on the IPinCH project, they're not working with communities, they're not getting out to communities or working with urban Aboriginal groups or what have you. They're going to see, art at the Museum of Anthropology or something. So I think that, it is important to think about what they're learning in those spaces, and to think of that as one piece of the overall puzzle that we're looking at IPinCH, of messages about Indigenous heritage and ownership and presentation. Because when you talk about museums, there are physical objects that we're talking about, and they're complicated. There are issues of repatriating those objects. So there is an element of ownership that's very important both to the museums and to the communities. Sometimes it's very important to communities to say that they are the owners of the objects, but they're on permanent loan to the museum. And so there are issues of actual tangible ownership that are important. If the museum, whether the museum owns or is being loaned a mask, do they actually own it? They certainly don't own the intangible heritage around that mask ever, because it's difficult to quantify that really, but I think there are parts of heritage that can be owned, and there are complicated ownership debates within museums and and all these other disciplines that we're talking about of archaeology and anthropology. Like, as an anthropologist, I also try to challenge my own notions of what ownership means. I think if we're talking from a purely, Western capitalist perspective, there's a certain notion of what ownership is that I don't think makes sense in a lot of other contexts. It might not make sense to say the Inuit. I don't know that they think of themselves. I don't know that they would use the word ownership to talk about the Inukshuk, but I know that they feel that the symbolism does belong to their community. I think a lot of Indigenous communities might think more of stewardship rather than ownership, and being responsible for taking care of something rather than owning it. It's a complicated project, and it's sometimes difficult to explain it to people. When we were at one of the steering committee retreats, the kind of catchphrase we came up with is that it's an innovative academic project. So it is at its core an academic project in that it's located in a university. Most of the main researchers are professors or have an affiliation with the university or are students, but it seeks to do something different, which is to utilize community-based methods in working with communities, but also really seeing Indigenous communities and cultural groups as equal partners in the research. So, that's why it's different. It's something that I end up having a lot of conversations with, kind of non-academic friends about, and it's quite complicated because, as a lot of people say, all art is derivative, all fashion, it's okay to be inspired by, art and culture from, art and music from different cultures, but then where's that line of when it's inappropriate and harmful? And it can be really difficult to identify. And I also don't know, me as an individual, am I always the best person to try to say this is okay and this is not okay? What I try to find out is, what do communities think? If I'm on a blog, a Maori blog, and they're saying, this use of Maori tattoo styles of moko is really inappropriate, then that's where I'm going to get my information from. So I think that's how to approach some of those questions, is to actually be listening to communities. And I think that's part of what IPinCH is about too, is what are communities saying? How are they saying that it affects them and causes them harm? And sometimes the harm is, a spiritual or an emotional harm that isn't something that, I can understand as somebody from being outside of the community. It's a human rights issue that Indigenous people have a right to manage their heritage. A word that gets thrown around a lot these days is reconciliation, and I think part of what IPinCH probably seeks to do is to, start some fresh relationships that are more based on equal partnerships that may, a lot of communities in the past have had really bad relationships with archaeologists or anthropologists, or might feel that their heritage has been used in ways that were inappropriate or harmful to them. So it's a way to kind of start a reconciliation process in the field of heritage.